Welcome to our last lecture, where we will be focusing on Gothic art. So Gothic art is a style that was used from the 12th through the 14th century. It emerges out of Romanesque art. You'll see that it's similar. Please study the packet, the Romanesque versus Gothic packet, to really understand and recognize the differences between these two styles, because it's all about the details in which we can tell the difference. So these Gothic builders, they refined these massive cathedrals. We have new elements like the flying buttresses. We have stained glass windows, which will be utilized. The Romanesque period, on the interiors, it was a much darker, they were much darker compared to the Gothic period because they didn't have as many windows. We also are going to utilize much more groin vaulting. Groin vaulting was used in the Romanesque, but I want you to more associate it with the Gothic art period. And so there's this idea of creating these heavenly environments on earth, that these cathedrals are meant to be extraordinary. They're meant to put you into a state of recognizing the divine, of seeing that this is what the heavens would be like, compared to the majority of the surrounding structures around these cathedrals. Gothic cathedrals are also built in the cities, whereas more Romanesque buildings are built outside. We still have many pilgrims, we still have relics within them. And so they're important, especially we'll see the rise of the Virgin Mary, but they're important in bringing followers to Christ. Gothic art also blends some Byzantine elements. Again, we'll see Romanesque elements. But this is also during the period of the Crusades. So there are multiple crusades in which Christians are trying to take over Jerusalem. We've discussed numerous times how this is such an important place for numerous religions. And so during these crusades, they actually bring back Islamic elements, particularly with pointed arches. So we'll see some of that here. The term Gothic was not used by contemporary people. It was actually later created by an early Renaissance figure, a writer, Giorgio Vasari, and where he used it as a derogatory term, actually. So the Gothic period, it's beautiful. It was just each style reacts to the previous one. Oh, also with this one, so this style, we can trace the exact year in which it started, which isn't common with many other styles. And so it was actually created by Abbé Suger. It looks like sugar, but it's Suger, in France, just like our Romanesque. This is the origin of it. And the Saint Denis Abbey. And so this was a Romanesque church, which it burnt down, and he decided to rebuild it in this much more elaborate style. He was really high up there in the church. He even served as regent for a period of time when the king had gone off to the Crusades. But essentially, he creates this new style, and it begins in 1120. So this example on the right, the Saint Denis, is this mix that we see because it's our transition piece. The Gothic period is also divided into early, high, and late Gothic. You don't really need to know that, though. So let's head into the Cathedral of Notre Dame charter. And this Gothic church was built, or is the first church to be built in the Gothic style. It was intentionally built with the Gothic style. As we can see, these flying buttresses, the stained glass windows, and there's this real vertical element compared with our Romanesque. These tall spires, etc. So here we have the Cathedral of Saint Charter. Oh, Notre Dame is a common phrase used for many churches. You may think Notre Dame and think of the famous one in Paris, but it means Our Lady. And many of these churches are dedicated to the Virgin Mary, so that's what it's actually referencing. So I say this as Charter Cathedral so we don't confuse it with the most famous one, the most famous Notre Dame in Paris, but just an FYI, it's referring to these churches being dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And so here we have these flying buttresses that hold up this structure. So if you haven't yet, you need to study those videos that were assigned for this unit, as well as the Romanesque versus Gothic packet. So here are the specific ones at this cathedral. As you can see, they vary in shape, size, etc. But this enables stained glass windows to emerge in architecture because they're being held up by these buttresses. And so with our Romanesque period, the heavy stone, you're too nervous to cut it out to create these windows. So there's small windows, it's much darker, but now we have this extra structural support. So we have the emergence of stained glass windows. And here we go. Here's the interiors. You can see there's much more light because there's many more windows. There's also groin vaulting. We were looking at the barrel vaults of the Romanesque. Again, there are examples of rib vaulting. Sorry, did I say groin vaulting? My bad. There are examples of rib vaulting within the Romanesque time period, but it's really identified with the Gothic period. And here's the exterior. As you can see, these portals are just so ornate and elaborate. And another key element of the Gothic cathedrals are these rose windows. So we're looking at the stained glass within here and looking at the rose window. Right here, here's the interior. So these stained glass windows, the many stained glass windows, tell stories of the life of Christ, of Old Testament, New Testament stories. Again, you're trying to communicate these important stories to a primarily illiterate population. So you need to make really clear depictions. So let's hone in on the rose window and our central figure, the Virgin Mary. So here is what's referred to as the throne of wisdom. And the throne of wisdom was actually a motif utilized during the Byzantine period as well. But so it's multifaceted. It's a deep meaning into where this is Mary is seated on a throne, but she serves as the throne for Christ. So consider how Jesus Christ is sitting in her lap, and so she is the throne for Christ. At this time period, we have the clear establishment of colors associated with Mary. This blue and this red, she almost always has this blue cloak surrounding her from here on out. And so this also refers to the Old Testament story, the idea of Solomon's throne, etc. So it's this importance on the Virgin Mary being this connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So she serves as the throne for Christ. Mary's seen as this connection, this authority in Christianity, but also this primary connection to Christ, in which if you are praying to Mary, it's with the intention of this message getting to Christ. Here's a close-up. She is holding the scepter with the fleur-de-lis, which is still to this day associated with France. Here's another depiction of the Virgin Mary. Notice how she's in all blue, and that is signifying her virginity, where this belief that she was the idea of immaculate conception, where she became pregnant with Christ as a virgin. But again, he's seated in her lap, this idea of her authority. She's wearing this crown. There's some arguments to be made that this specific image was patronized by the Queen, and so there's this association connecting the idea of the Queen taking care of the next ruler, taking care of the people, and establishing her authority. Other stained glass window of Christ. And so let's now move on to the Reims Cathedral. So you can see it's very Gothic. So Gothic is, I want you to think almost like extra. It's very dramatic. There's many more details than the Romanesque period. And so what you'll notice here are these pointed arches that I referred to. It helps to distribute weight a little bit differently, but it came from Islamic art. These people were bringing it back from the Islamic world after they had gone to the Crusades, and so it's utilized within Gothic architecture. But what I want to focus on are these jam figures in our portal. And so we're looking at the side where we have the Annunciation and the Visitation, but I want to focus on these two figures. So the Visitation is where Mary, Mother of Christ, and Elizabeth, Mother of John the Baptist, meet while they're pregnant. And so this, John the Baptist foretold of the coming of Christ. They lived contemporary. Christ had baptized John the Baptist later. But coming back to these two figures. And so we have this image as what's called the visitation. Now let's just consider and appreciate this change in figure style, where we went from these squat figures that essentially had started in the late antique. There's not this emphasis on realism or idealism, etc., but now we're heading back to these classical motifs. First, right from the get-go, we are standing in contrapposto pose. It is now back. And both of these figures look like individual people, especially Elizabeth. She looks like a real person, essentially. They have these robes. The drapery reminds us of any type of Greek sculptures that we saw where there was drapery involved. They're realistic proportions. The Virgin Mary is idealized. And so we start to see this reappreciation for the classical elements, for realism. During the Romanesque period, people were still almost too nervous to create realistic figures. Remember, they didn't want anyone to have impure thoughts about the human body, and they were also really scared of idolatry. So we see this shift where now we are showing these realistic images, and the purpose is that it's meant to help communicate these stories. We also have a shift in the message of Christianity, where it's more this emphasis on this forgiveness and this unconditional love from Christ and from Mary, etc. And so we do see this transition. Now note, there are still various styles. We're about to look at some other figures in which they look like the medieval ages. We'll see even a different variation. But just note, we are starting to come into this idea of appreciating classical elements again, which leads up to the Renaissance, the next style. So here's the rock. The Pietà is the idea that after Christ was taken down from the cross, that Mary held him. We'll look at another scene where there are other figures around Mary holding Christ. That's the Lamentation, but this one specifically where it's only Mary and the deceased Christ, that is called the Pietà. It's not actually from a story in the Bible, but it becomes really popular during this time period and during the Renaissance. And so think of how we were just looking at Mary holding her son. We talked about in the Romanesque period and before about how she knew what was to come. And so here we have that culmination where he did die, and it was a really gruesome death. And so we're seeing that here. It's gruesome. It's uncomfortable to look at. And it's meant to be. So the purpose of that is there's this emergence in the perception of Christ's suffering and this emphasis on it by different leaders in the Roman Catholic Church, where prior to this period, well, there's this argument, it's this new philosophy or theology, I should say, where Jesus and the figures in the Old and New Testament seemed too detached from humanity, that it was difficult for people entering into these cathedrals to identify with this. So there's this disconnect going on. And so now there's this shift in this argument to be made that by showing Christ and Mary's suffering, that it creates this stronger connection to the people who are viewing this sculpture. That you recognize this suffering because you too have felt the suffering. This is a very difficult time period for most people. And so you recognize this, that Mary has suffered too. She has suffered great loss, that Christ suffered for the people, that he died for their sins so that they could have forgiveness. And so this helps to create this stronger connection with followers. So it's this different Christ. We also see the emergence of Christ on the cross during this time period. Going into slightly secular, we have this Blanche of Castile page. Basically, it's the folio 8 page from this moralized Bible. This is illuminated manuscript. We have ink, tempera, and gold leaf on vellum. So consider how we're still seeing these Byzantine elements of the gold. But essentially, the historical context is that after the death of King Louis VIII, his wife, Blanche of Castile, took charge of ruling France. There's all these rebellions and challenges. Again, it's a really difficult time period. And she secured stability for her son, Louis IX, to assume the throne in 1234. And so here we see her and her son. He's shown more youthful, where she is leading him. And this is from a Bible, the Moralized Bible, where it teaches good Christian morals. So there's this idea of she is raising him up to be a moral king. We see the fleur-de-lis on their crowns, indicative symbol of France. So we're still seeing these medieval elements, but there is this shift. There's this change occurring. Notice how the figure style is into squat, where yes, they're slightly, they're very thin looking, but we're coming to a little bit more of realistic proportions at least. But this symbolizes where she's this connection between the political authority and the religious authority, and she's essentially sending this message that he will be a moral king. So it encourages support for him. Coming into our incredible example of this massive sculpture, and we're seeing the death of the Virgin at the Strasbourg Cathedral. And so this is from 1230. And so this is the tympan, and we have these extremely realistic figures. Look how they almost look individualized. We have definitively this classical style that's coming through, and where the Virgin Mary is laying on her bed and where she is dying. And this is above the entrance to this church. So you're communicating this message of suffering, of appreciation for her, this stronger connection of where you can identify with the suffering. Here we have Christ looking down upon her. Consider it like from the heavens. And so all of these sculptures and these stained glass windows are essentially supposed to be educational. And to create a connection. So you're not only communicating the stories from the Bible, but you're creating these images in which you identify with. It helps to create this strong connection. Here's an equestrian portrait within the Bamberg Cathedral in Germany. So we've moved up into the north. And there's some different ideas about this sculpture. So consider how realistic it looks and how this looks like an individual. This looks like a real person. It's not just a generic face. However, we're not sure who it actually, the horseman is unidentified, essentially. We're not sure who it is. Perhaps it was a ruler or a biblical figure or an emperor from this time period or St. George. We're not really sure. But there is this great sense of authority and power. So think of the numerous equestrian statues that we studied in previous units, where that in itself indicates power. He's wearing this crown upon his head. He's shown in control upon this horse. And we start to see the emergence of some expression, where he does seem thoughtful. His lips are slightly parted, his brows are furrowed. He seems to be looking at something specific and considering it. Consider the realistic posture in which he's seated, but he's slightly turning. And so there's this emergence of more realistic images, which leads us into the Renaissance to come next. We also have many images like this one within the Gothic period, especially in Italy. And so here we have Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets. And so we still have these definitive Byzantine elements, the gold leaf that is surrounding her. And so this is still being practiced. We haven't gotten rid of the Byzantine elements. With the change in the church, later after the Protestant Revolution, etc. But anyway, this type of style becomes more associated with Eastern Orthodox. But during the Gothic period, it is still utilized, especially in Italy. And here we come to the Scrovini Chapel. We'll be looking at the Lamentation. And so here is the end of our Gothic, our late Gothic time period, though this chapel is often associated with pre-Renaissance. We often study it right at the beginning of the next semester, or it's 1304. And so here we have this family chapel in their home rather than at a cathedral. And so we can see that we have the stories of Christ throughout here. And we're going to be looking at the Lamentation, and notice this shift. So we have these Renaissance ideas that come next, and we start to see this as a precursor to these ideas here. So let's discuss space, where we have this clear foreground. Okay, this figure's back is to us, holding in Christ. Mary is holding his head, and then we have the middle ground in which these figures look upon it. We have this rock, and then behind them is the background, and we can see up in the heavens these figures looking down. Notice how these figures look more classical. We aren't quite in our extremely realistic elements here, but we're starting to see the emergence of it. There's this major shift from the medieval period to this late Gothic, early Renaissance, pre-Renaissance painting that we're looking at. We're utilizing color, and consider the shading that's going on here, this highlighting versus the shadow, etc., to create this sense of volume and depth, the realistic proportions. We're not quite seeing the emotion that we'll see with the Renaissance in the following units, but we start to see this emerging. The Lamentation, like I said earlier, is where it is Mary and her son surrounded by other figures, rather than just the Pietà, which is just her and her son. So here we have the culmination and transition work, which leads into the next semester.